So let's start with a few developments on the Twitter front. And why I focus on Twitter so much is Twitter is an incredibly, not only is it entertaining and a little soul sucking, but it's an incredibly consequential platform for the entire world and for how people consume news and information. So any news about Twitter is going to be significant. And there's a few things that have been going on. One of them just makes me so damn happy, I can hardly stand it. So there was a tweet that someone was saying that Twitter has been out there like nuking pedophilia accounts or people who like promote or sympathize with pedophilia, which why wasn't that happening before? Elon Musk said removing child exploitation is priority number one. Please reply in comments if you see anything that Twitter needs to address. So Andy No responded to that. If you don't know Andy No, he contributes to the Post Millennial, and he literally wrote the book on Antifa. It's called Unmasked. In fact, I haven't talked about this publicly, but he asked to interview me for that book. But at the time, my bosses at Fox, I believe we had switched ownership to Fox by then, or it might have just been on the brink of that, refused to allow me to. And I, in part, understood their argument because I have been a target of anarchists in Seattle for a decade. It's hard for me to go out at any of the protests that happen without being targeted or physically assaulted. And so their logic was that they thought, since Andy No is like enemy number one for Antifa, they thought by me participating in the book or being quoted in the book, it would make me even more of a target and put me even more in danger. And so I kind of understood that, but they refused to let me participate in what has become a New York Times bestseller, Unmasked. But he's also editor at large for the Post Millennial. And look, he's become like a controversial guy because he goes after Antifa and the left just hates Andy No for it. But he responded to Elon Musk and said a large number of Antifa accounts operate on Twitter to promote riots, give tips on how to commit violent crimes, and post names, photos, and addresses of targets, plus their family members. And Elon Musk immediately responded to that and said incitement to violence will result in account suspension. And Andy No proceeded to point out a bunch of instances where he personally has been doxxed. He was violently physically assaulted by Antifa. It's something that he's documented quite a bit in the past. But so he was sharing on Twitter a couple of these instances, saying last year Antifa used Twitter to direct comrades to swarm me after I ran into a hotel following a violent street beating. Elon Musk responded, that is a disturbing story, very concerning that Twitter took no action, despite a clear violation of the terms of service. Report in this thread. So I'm going to get into more of this in a second, but the reason this just pleases the hell out of me is Antifa, and okay, first pause. Let's talk about the phrase Antifa, because technically it stands for anti-fascist, which isn't a bad thing, right? And that's the argument we'll always hear is, why are you against Antifa? It stands for anti-fascist. Well, Antifa is a name co-opted by anarchists and anarchists that stand for violence and vandalism. So they've co-opted that word. That is what they call themselves. So if you have an issue with that, take it up with them. Don't take it up with us for calling them what they call themselves. Anyway, I had noticed over the years the extent to which Antifa and anarchists in Seattle used Twitter as a way to organize. It happened during the summer of 2020 in Seattle during Chaz Chop, where they, had these kind of threads going on, where sometimes it would be kind of cryptic language, but it was like this wording that they used to communicate with each other and try to say, hey, here's where we're going, here's what we're trying to do. And it always seemed like Twitter just turned a blind eye to it. Like, you have other people who are being suspended for incitement to violence or even less than that. And then you had these Antifa accounts that were just operating freely out in the open. And I think this is one of the main problems I had with Twitter, that its terms of service didn't seem to be applied evenly or equally. And so Elon Musk saying, hey, I'm going to take incitement to violence seriously no matter who does it, which is a really good thing. I invited Andy No on the show to talk about this exchange with Elon Musk and what he hopes will come from it. Andy, welcome to Undivided. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Did you expect Elon Musk to respond so quickly to your concern that you raised?
I didn't because everyone has been tagging Elon Musk for a number of months now, actually, and it I was really shocked that he did acknowledge finally something that I've been trying to raise attention to those who are higher up at Twitter, that that platform is the primary platform that are used by far left violent extremists to organize, promote violence, and then to raise funds for um, criminal suspects if they happen to be arrested and face, a prosecution process.
So over the years, and I mentioned this before we got started, but you did literally write the book on Antifa. And I don't know that there's a journalist in the world who covers that element more closely than you do. What had been your experience pre-Elon Musk owning Twitter when you were threatened on Twitter, or when you saw people trying to use Twitter to organize acts of extremism? What had been your experience with the platform?
Well, I'm so glad I'm speaking with you now because I did write about in my book a little bit about what happened to you back in 2020 in Chaz. So what happened to me was basically just a more intense version of what happened to you. Um, so the threats started off online on social media, things like "you better stop coming," and I ignored most of it because I was naive. This was years ago. I was naive at that time, thinking that I have a First Amendment right to document these activities that are happening in public, and these are branding themselves as protests, and protests um, are meant to bring attention to something. And so I kept going out until eventually I was beaten, hospitalized, and then I've been attacked since then as well. But the role of Twitter is really critical, and this was something that I actually heard with my own ears when I was underground, which is that mutual aid, this is a quote, mutual aid cannot happen without Twitter. And so because the platform can allow people to make accounts anonymously, and then because a lot of these people know who they are in real life, they're already connected to certain Discord servers or Signal chat groups where new accounts can be amplified, where digital flyers are disseminated, telling people when and where to show up. And there are usually dog whistles of things about violence, such as remember to block up, which is to wear head to toe black, cover your faces, bring riot gear, and they'll have various symbols of Antifa. Usually they avoid doing things that are explicitly Antifa and branding a logo, and I think they do that because they're afraid of maybe federal RICO charges or conspiracy charges. So they, in terms of the branding, often keep it more vague, but not always. Um, and then during the course of rioting as well, or the direct action or protest, whatever you want to call it, real time on social media, they will have a whole brigade of people giving live updates. They're listening to the police radio calls. They're keeping a good eye on, and they have people physically out in different locations, letting people know on Twitter, this street there are police, that street has police, stay out, go this way to avoid being kettled. So in real time, Twitter is used also then for them to escape from being arrested in the course of carrying out their riotous activities. And then afterwards, if there happens to be the few arrests, immediately when bail needed, then the links to the various ways to fundraise, whether it be through Cash App or Venmo or GoFundMe or even some so-called nonprofit groups, these links will be blasted out and shared so that internationally people who are allies and supporter of this violent extremist ideology can pour in money and immediately get their comrades out. So it's a whole system that has been crucial in making the riots in Seattle, in Portland, in many cities extremely effective. And over, many of these Twitter accounts are actually explicitly violating the terms of service of Twitter, such as against releasing private information. And by that, I'm not talking about pictures that are taken in public or names of criminal suspects as I do, or the booking photos. By personal information, I'm talking about like phone numbers, the names of their family members, their children, and their addresses. And of course, where they work and the phone numbers to where they work so that people can call and make allegations and often lies to get people fired. So Yeah, I mean, the riots in 2020 that we saw in the United States could not have happened to scale and length that they did without Twitter.
Yeah, and I remember talking about that in real time. And I did for the first time, just to clear the air, because we've never talked about this publicly. I don't think either of us. You asked me to interview me for your book, and I was not allowed to do an interview with you for the book. And now the reason that my bosses gave is they didn't want me to be more of a target. But I think you and I are on the same page of, I'd rather be a target and have people know what's going on and be truthful about it than stay silent about it. So I've always not been comfortable with the fact that I wasn't allowed to talk to you for that, but we can get into that a little bit later. Um, in 2020, we saw there would be hashtags they'd be following that had real time updates and information. When you saw instances that were clear violations of the Twitter terms of service, were you making a concerted effort to try to report those violations?
I was, but the thing is, the Antifa accounts they wised up very quickly about being reported. So what they would often do is they have developed these mass blocking scripts that can run through and will block, let's say they enter my name and everybody who's following me, all 1 million followers, or at that time it would have been a few 100,000, would be automatically blocked. That means then when, for example, if I happen to bring attention to a tweet, the URL, and post it on Twitter, people wouldn't be able to report it because you go to the account and you've already been blocked. So you cannot even report it as easily. There's another way to do that, which means going on to on the desktop and logging into Twitter's has a separate reporting form. It's more complicated and most people just won't do it. So a lot of the posts that, in my opinion, would be violating terms of service and would likely have been removed just weren't reported. And yeah, and they're very good at keeping their communities insular as well, also for that reason. And another thing I forgot to mention earlier is about the role of Twitter and also identifying the real-time locations of targets they want people to either actually assault or prevent from documenting events. I've seen it happen with you and other journalists, and of course myself. They'll say, "Hey, this person is here," that, and they will often actually explicitly call for their cameras to go and destroy the camera, break the camera, or somehow prevent them from observing and documenting the activities that are happening.
So do you think that when we're talking about Twitter and changes pre-Elon Musk and post-Elon Musk, do you think that Twitter didn't take Antifa threats of violence or incitement as seriously as other people like the individuals who participated in January 6th? Or was it just that Antifa was using Twitter in a smarter way?
I think it's a combination of both, but probably the far left and Antifa were able to be better at organizing on Twitter because they were allowed to. In certain contexts, Twitter has shown itself to be very, very effective at content moderation. So around 2013, 14, 15, when hundreds and potentially thousands of people in the West were being radicalized and recruited for the Islamic State through Twitter, actually. That's where a lot of these contacts were being made. A lot of the propaganda and videos and content was posted on Twitter at that time. Twitter eventually, under pressure, was very good at removing all of that and being very quick to do it. So there's already a precedent to show that they can do it. And then, of course, when it comes to right-wing violence or right-wing extremism, that is talked about or promoted on Twitter, that is all shut down. And so they obviously have the means to do it, I think. And also, when it comes to even like removing disinformation with so-called misinformation or disinformation about COVID, that was shut down very quickly. But false claims around various police officer involved shootings of people, lies that were used to incite violence, that was kept up. And so I think it came down, in my opinion, to likely, within the personnel and staff of Twitter having an ideological bias that allow them to look the other way and not view the seriousness of the threat that comes from left-wing political violence extremism.
Yeah, it sounds like, and I agree with you. It feels like Twitter had the capacity to squash that kind of chatter in 2020 if they had the willingness to do it.
Yeah, and it's not like in the end that nobody was victimized. We had neighborhoods burnt down. We had police departments that were relentlessly under violent attacks and arson attacks day after day after day. We had people who were maimed. We had journalists who had their cameras destroyed, who were injured in other ways. We had people who were hospitalized, and then we also had um, it became deadly in Portland as well. People keep overlooking, you know, what really irritates me is that the mainstream press is very quick to describe the 6th of January as a deadly rioting or deadly insurrection, whatever you want to use. But they use, the adjective deadly, which is accurate. People did die that day, but they don't use that to describe the riots that was deadly in Portland, for example. They still use euphemisms such as racial justice protests. That's how I often see it in the paper or record. And the framing of this stuff is actually really important because, I mean, this is going more at an aggregate level, but it's what I've seen. And then, in the criminal justice system, in the rare times that there are prosecutions, then when there's a jury, the people are not really informed on actually what happened in 2020 because of the euphemisms that we use to describe the violent, deadly riots in the United States that year.
The CNN fiery but mostly peaceful headline is one I'll just never be able to get past. It's a good example of that. So in the day after Elon responded to you on Twitter, you were posting a couple tweets saying that there had been some Antifa connected accounts that were suspended. Do you believe that's a result of Elon Musk seeing your tweet and taking action, or just a coincidence?
I wouldn't know for sure either way, but I take Elon at his word because I asked him when, like, well, what can we do to to bring this to Twitter's attention when there are all these accounts that do inciting violence, calling for violence, etc. And he said for now, his response on summarizing it to just post here on this thread, which is what I've still been continuing to do now for days on end now, and many of them have been suspended. I always bring receipts, but some of them haven't. So I don't really know what the decision-making process is behind that. It's just I'm just trying my best to show that there are numerous accounts that have for years been able to get away with incitement to violence and calls for murder. And here's the proof, here's the evidence.
How worried are you, though, that this is going to put even more of a target on your back? And is it already? What have you seen or heard since this exchange with Elon happened?
Yes, of course I'm worried. Anytime that my name is trending on Twitter, it usually corresponds with threats on my life or those around me. I have received a threat already, and it referenced specifically the brief communication with Elon and also my tweets about Antifa, and I have referred that to law enforcement. Um, it's it's something I think about every day just because I have paid a very, very heavy price for the beat that I've chosen to focus on. And sometimes it feels actually very isolating too, because I mean, for years I was um, trying to bring attention to all the ways that these accounts organize on Twitter, and I was, ignored essentially. Reports made would come back either as not a violation of Twitter, shockingly, or nothing would happen. Um, Now that, you know, I got the attention of someone high up, it feels in some ways a little bit vindicating because I have like a lot of evidence that I've already posted on the past. So it's very easy for me to bring up these those old posts again to show. Um, but of course, I'm scared as well for um, um, those around me who yeah, I mean, we're dealing with, the violent extremists that I seek to expose. Often, many of them have nothing to lose, and so, um, yeah, this is it's it's been a very heavy punishment. And then, of course, then on the whole media side, and so what people are posting online are lots of smears to try to ruin my reputation, to make me appear as somebody who is far-right extremist, a neo-Nazi, or unreliable, or a liar. And I mean, I've been dealing with that from like the minute that I became a semi-public figure when I was beaten in 2019. It was actually really surreal because I was still in the hospital and I was seeing how all these blue checkmark journalists, how they were describing me not as the victim of a really serious assault that led to a brain hemorrhage, but rather somebody who's a provocateur who brought it upon himself. So I guess a lot of this is really kind of, more of the same, but it's still um, it's it it's still scary. Yeah.
You know, it's hard to watch the mainstream media pick and choose which acts of violence against journalists are fine and which are something that they need to, explode over. And the mainstream media has completely ignored attacks on you, threats against you, because they don't like your perceived political affiliation, I guess. What do you think? I mean, what impact does that have? I know you spoke about it a little bit there, but I mean, what do you attribute that to, I guess? The mainstream media just completely turning a blind eye to some of what's happened to you.
I think it shows me how corrupt much of the mainstream media has become. I think there's a certain uh, ideological infestation that has come out from a lot of these communication and journalism programs. So you see, well, you see what how I mean, you just look at the Twitter accounts of journalists who work in legacy media and papers or records, and you see what they say. You can see their bias, and that's reflected in their reporting. And so for me, Andy is seen as somebody that's not just unsympathetic, but must be silenced, actually. And it's a lot of journalists who, many of them are, um, particularly in the online news sites, are in communication with the Antifa accounts. They get their intel from them. They get many even narratives. And so, yeah, the goal is to isolate us one by one, and by us I'm referring to people who, people like me are often independent or part of small conservative media, and we don't have the institutional backings to really often withstand the type of pressure that they face on us to really destroy us, right? Make us actually literally unsafe, physically attacked, and then at the end of the day, like deplatformed quite often. It's it was really sad to me. For example, I've been a member of the Society of Professional Journalists for several years, and I reached out to the Oregon chapter where I'm a paying member when I was severely beaten in May of 2021 in the course of doing some undercover field observation in Portland, and they never even responded to my email. And um, when even when the Committee to Protect Journalists have written about me, some of the assaults, they will have like a whole paragraph asterisk saying that Andy describes himself as a journalist. This is in dispute, and it's kind of I mean, okay, I know a lot of people disagree with my commentary. I accept that. That's fine. But a lot of the video that I recorded in the past, the reason why I did video was actually so that I didn't, so there was no commentary on it. That was intentional, and still that work was also delegitimized. So um, it, that delegitimization is actually really effective because then, people. Well, I mean, it's about control and power. It's about directing legitimacy back to themselves and saying anybody else who falls afoul of these certain claims or narratives are untrustworthy. And I'm not somebody who's against necessarily legacy media. I don't want to see all of it destroyed. A lot of that reputation was built up for good reason. And there are a lot of people who identify themselves as journalists who don't really properly fact check themselves and put out a lot of incorrect information. I've always been very clear that it's, and I know you have too, that when I get it wrong, it's important to acknowledge that and to remove that information and to apologize. And so, um, but certainly it's really, um, it does feel like kind of like I'm in this alone, and and sometimes literally that's how it is, right? If I'm the victim of various assaults in the course of my work, there will be no legacy journalists' rights organizations that will stick up for me.
And I see the same thing happening to Jonathan Cho in Seattle. I don't know how close you guys are or what kind of communication that you've had, but I mean, he's been doing some tremendous work covering the homeless crisis. And if anybody took 6 minutes to watch a video of his, it's journalistic by any standard, but he gets absolutely demonized and vilified. The mainstream media here doesn't stand up for him. I've written about it. So it's really sad to see because it is a strategy that the mainstream media feeds into. And so you're not alone, Andy. I'm here for you. I don't know if that means anything, but see what's
It
happening.
does mean something, Brandy, because you come from the legacy media world, and I think and I see that you still hold yourself up to all those professional standards. So, the fact that you invite me on to be able to share my reporting, my story with your audience that you carried over from your past work, that means a lot, because the goal of, you know, my detractors, our detractors, is to make it so that people cannot find out about our reporting, to make us ineffective, to make it so that our reporting doesn't reach any audience.
Let's end with this. On the Twitter front, on Antifa, as you said, you think has been a very powerful tool for them to carry out the acts of violence and vandalism that they have over the past few years. Let's say that Twitter and Elon Musk, they're serious and they really clamp down on those Antifa affiliated accounts. Will they just go somewhere else? Will they just find another place to do everything that they've been doing on Twitter? And if so, what is that platform going to be? What is it?
Yeah, well, first, one thing I wanted to say that I didn't say earlier is that, my goal is not just to see Antifa accounts removed. It's not even really about the ideology. It's about those who specifically call, incite, and organize violence. So to me, it's irrelevant where on the line of ideology it falls on. Um, what I've been trying to bring attention to is there is one fringe element that's been able to get away with it and been able to carry out violence for so much. Now, regarding where they go next, a lot of them are on Mastodon. They're falling back on their Discord servers. They're of course going to. I mean, they have really a lot of very intelligent people in support of the movement, and they're going to organize and re-strategize how to be effective. But for now, denying them the space to be able to organize on the biggest social media platform, or one of the biggest, is a huge blow to them. I keep making an analogy to Islamic State and jihadism because I do find it actually similar in many ways. We're not seeing a lot of the same level amounts of terrorist attacks by IS sympathizers or IS members because their territory in Syria and Iraq was taken away from them, and that actually really matters. I think there's probably some analogy that over time, as they lose more and more of their ability to openly incite and organize violence on Twitter, it's going to be a huge blow. And they'll group up somewhere else, as motivated ideologues will do. We'll have to see. But of course, it'll be up to journalists and counter-extremism researchers to find out where they're organizing next. But unfortunately, there aren't very many journalists doing this, and almost no counter-extremism researchers who focus on the organizing tactics of the far left, sadly.
Well, I think this is a great start. The fact, as we said earlier, that Elon Musk responded right away. There are some counts suspended. I'm looking forward to seeing, how far they take that. So, Andy, stay safe out there to the extent that you can. And where can people find your work?
Andy-ngo.com.
All right. Well, hey, we appreciate it, and we'll have you back on. Okay.
Thank you so much, Brandy.